From the JLE in London, you're listening to History for the Curious, the podcast. 20 minutes with Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, hosted by myself, Menat Reisner. Join us as we cross continents, sail through the centuries, tracing lives, uncovering events, and following epic journeys to reveal the untold stories and the mysteries that have impacted our history and shaped us into who we are today. Welcome back, Rabbi Hirsch. Welcome back to all the listeners and Gemara Tov. We've had our break for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we are back with a fantastic new series on the Rambam. So, the Rambam, Rabbi Hirsch, where do we begin?
So, no Jewish figure is more famous in our history than the Rambam.
Well, that's quite a big statement.
Well, with regards to general audiences, but even religious from audiences, excepting perhaps Rashi. And if we were to put it in one sentence, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, the son of Maimon, hence Maimonides, or Abu Imram Musa ibn Maimun in Arabic, was born in Cordoba in Spain in the 1130s and died in Cairo in 1204, having also lived in Morocco, and he authored 3 great works.
Why does he hold such a massive place in our history?
Well, his achievements are enormous. They are also multifaceted. In the world of Torah, he is known as the great arbiter of halacha, the author of the Mishna Torah that codifies all of Jewish law. In academic circles, he is known as the great philosopher who wrote Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. Historians relate to him as the influential communal leader who served as the Nagid, as it was known, leader of Egypt's Jewish community. And to the world at large, he is recognized as one of the most famous physicians in history, and all his pieces have been translated into English. And therefore there are thousands of yeshivas and high schools and dozens of hospitals around the world named after him, which you don't find with any other person as such. Secondly, we have a lot of data about his life, primarily drawn from his own books and letters, but also his friends and opponents, both of whom we shall meet, write about him. Yet, interestingly, there are things accepted as fact about him which are either untrue or unverifiable, and equally there are areas which are reliably recorded but people don't know about them. For instance, his diet, his relationship with others, his family, and put this all together with the fact that he wasn't some academic, writing works in an ivory tower, or even Talmud Chacham living in isolation writing Sfarim. He was incredibly involved in the Egyptian Kehillah and wider afield. He literally endangered his life for Jews on a number of occasions, and these things are part of his life story. And he was the greatest in his generation in terms of Torah. The Chazon Ish in Bechoros writes that the writings of the Rambam are beyond the natural capabilities of a human being, and he was clearly given a gift from God. And the Chazon Ish adds, this is what occurs to those who learn Torah lishma, for its sake. And we know that more than 1,000 Sfarim have been written on his works. So what we're going to try and do is fill in some blanks, remove misconceptions, and hopefully round out his biography. And start with the fact that he was born in Cordoba, which was then the capital of Andalusia in Muslim Spain, and was the largest and most affluent city in Europe. The Muslims had conquered Cordoba in the 8th century, but Jews had been there prior to that, probably from Roman times. And his family lived in the southwest part of the city, which was the Jewish quarter, and the Great Mosque and the Royal Palace were very nearby. They were the symbols of Islamic authority. And the quarter itself was small, it was crowded, it had narrow streets.
Was his ancestry from that city as well?
Probably. I couldn't tell you how far back it goes, although we know their names, because at one point he signs himself Moshe, the son of Maimon, who was a Dayan, the son of Yosef, who was a Chacham, the son of Yitzchak, who was a Dayan, and he goes further back. And his father actually was his first, perhaps his only teacher.
Oh, so he had proper rabbinic lineage.
Yes, very much so.
And what about siblings?
Well, people generally know about his younger brother, David, and this brother writes to the Rambam at a later stage, sending good wishes to his sisters in the plural. So he had at least 2 sisters, but possibly 3. We never meet his mother, and it is said that she died in childbirth.
Wow. Now, we kind of know what he looks like. Just there's obviously the famous statue of him in Cordoba and on Israeli stamps. Is that what he looked like? You're going to say no, aren't you?
Well, let's broaden the question first. It's not just Israeli stamps. You would not believe how many countries have that figure of him in the turban, and the answer is, who knows? The earliest representation is an 18th century book dealing with antiquities, and it's got a medallion, and it claims that this is a portrait of him. But there's no written description of his appearance that has come to light. It's conjecture, maybe, you know.
Not like the Vilna Gaon's picture discovered in an attic.
That at least has a provenance in some measure. Now, the most obvious place to start is his date of birth, except we run into 2 alternatives. The date you find in most general biographies is 1135, in fact, Erev Pesach of 1135, and you'll find that engraved on his tombstone in Tveria, and the source for this is the copy of a report which very likely originates with his grandson, Rabbeinu David, but is preserved in a note that contradicts itself by giving the year as both 1133 and 1135, so it undermines its own impact. Whereas most academic works give the date as 1138. Now, I will admit that for the past 20 years I taught it as 1135, but based on what I've read up simply for this podcast, I'm leaning more towards the second date. It's to be found at the end of his commentary on the Mishnah, where he writes, I began the composition of this Perush when I was 23 years old. I completed it in Fustat when I was 30, in the year, 1479 of the Seleucid chronology, which is 1168, and therefore 1138. And it is a more reliable document.
And his date of death is also disputed?
No. 1204, Teves, we know that.
Right. So he spent his early life, as you said, in Muslim Spain.
Until 1148, which is when there was an Almohad invasion and everything changes. The Almohads were Muslim, and their movement originates in Morocco in the teachings of a messianic figure, the Mahdi, who wanted to restore the pure faith of Islam and enforce the rules of law. And they united, basically, North Africa and Spain under the rule of a single empire and gave the Jews 3 choices: exile, conversion, or death, which is one more than the Christians ever gave during the Crusades because there was no option of exile. But what it means is that suddenly Jews whose families have been living in Spain for hundreds of years have to make extreme choices. So many Jews feigned being Muslim to escape death or exile, and they became crypto-Jews, Anusim, which obviously predates the Marranos in Christian Spain by a few hundred years. And the Rambam, or his father really, takes the family out of Cordoba, which was a decision that leads to them wandering in Spain for the next decade, 10, 11 years. And you're talking at a time where there's no protection, there's no police, there's no shelter from animals, there's no obvious destination to go to. And in fact, we don't have information about where they lived. There is evidence that for some time they were in Seville, where the Rambam met with Muslim astronomers, and possibly that they ventured into the north of Spain, which was controlled by Christians, because at one stage the Rambam refers to the north of Spain as something with which he is familiar. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he says, you see at present in the country of the Franks, so maybe he was there. But by 1159, 1160, they left Spain for good and they moved to Morocco. And by then, he'd begun his scientific studies, and I quote, "The first thing I studied was the science called astrology, namely, the science by which a man knows what will occur in the world or what will occur to a certain individual during his entire life. I have also studied the entire subject of idolatry. There does not remain a composition on this topic that I have not read." And the reason for that was because both in halacha and in terms of mindset, he wanted to understand the parameters of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah.